Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for the 12th edition of the FreeFuse sessions. I'm here today with Morvareed Salehpour. She is the managing attorney of Salehpour Legal, a law firm specializing in startups and businesses in creating and negotiating the strongest contracts and tech transactions for scaling and protecting their businesses. She also counsels them on issues involved with services and product features and launches, intellectual property licensing and protection, data privacy rights, and cybersecurity issues. She has represented clients across the nation, ranging from entrepreneurs and small businesses to Fortune 500 companies, and works in a variety of industries. Ms. Salehpour is a graduate of UCLA and UCLA Law, and is also past president of the Santa Monica Bar Association, board member and career chair of the UCLA Alumni Westside Bruins Network, board member and co-event chair of UCLA Law Women Lead, and a regular speaker and writer on business and tech law issues. And without further ado, thank you so much for joining us. And would love to hear a little bit more from you, how you got started in law, and more importantly, what draws you to the tech industry.
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be here and join you all. As you shared, I'm a business and tech lawyer. I, knew I was interested in tech and law from a very young age, law and order, and the practice made law look fun. So I decided I want to be a lawyer, not knowing any real life lawyers at that time. And I was always very interested and intrigued by innovation and change. So I've been a futurist from a young age and knew I wanted to be doing work in the tech industry as well.
That's awesome. First of all, shout out to Law and Order. I have consumed so much Law and Order, everything from like the OG Sam Waterston Law and Order all the way to like SVU, Criminal Intent. Vincent D'Onofrio is an amazing actor. And it's funny that you mentioned that because it was definitely a consideration of mine, kind of like as I was growing up watching the shows themselves. So I don't think I've ever heard someone actually become inspired to be a lawyer from Law and Order. So that's super cool. That's the first time I've heard that.
TV made me do it.
Yeah. And what I really appreciate about, kind of learning about your story is you've had, you have all these accolades, and yet you also decide to work with startups, right? You have so many, points of experience that could lead you, like obviously working with all sorts of folks. But what is it about particularly, maybe, obviously being a futurist is one thing, but is there something that draws you to working with startups? Is there a particular kind of like moxie, or just like helping people protect and understand how to, kind of how to make their ideas more legitimate that comes with startups?
Yeah, as I started off at a large international law firm, right, with over 1,000 attorneys, working with Fortune 100 companies. I did the firm thing for about 8 years and left about 6 years ago and launched my own law practice to really focus on working with small and mid-sized businesses and startups. With my experience in the large law firm, I really realized during that process that one, I was entrepreneurial, and the big law firms are really kind of resistant to change and innovation, and they're not good fits for startups. So a lot of times I would see sometimes these smaller businesses, these mid-sized businesses, these startups go to a large law firm where they would be pushed off to a young attorney who doesn't really have experience. And then basically the business is paying, this client is paying a lot to train someone. So they're getting not as good work, they're paying more hours, they're paying higher rates, and they're just not, the firm doesn't really care about them because it's the small fish, right? They care about their big Fortune 100 clients. So there really is a market that needs this help, and they need more hand holding. So that was when I left and launched my own law practice and decided, hey, I'm going to help these kind of businesses because they really need someone to hold their hands and really help them set up their businesses from a place of strength so they can continue to grow and scale and get to that next level, whether it is investment or more rounds of investment or acquisition. And that's what I do, right? Being an entrepreneur myself, I know what it's like to run a business at a personal level, and I'm able to help my clients find that balance of the maximizing their business interests while minimizing legal risk in a way that makes sense for them so they can get to that next level.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, that's I feel like what brings that unique kind of lens that you have, which is you're an entrepreneur yourself, right? You're not as part of a larger firm. You've done it yourself. You've had to build up that client list and all of that. And even speaking on that for just a second, when you first got started, was it a challenge really kind of to sort of figure out how you were going to build something up on your own, or did you kind of like have an idea and you already sort of had the clients that you might have worked with previously? What were some of those things that you kind of went through as you were building up your own firm, back about 6 years ago?
Yeah, it's basically anything that every entrepreneur goes through, right? It's scary, it's exciting, it's all the emotions at one time. Coming from a very large law firm again, right, with over 1,000 attorneys and focused on working with these big companies, or these Fortune companies, I wasn't, I left. I didn't have clients because the Fortune 100 company is not going to go with me, right? They're going to stay with the large law firm. So it really was building a business from scratch, like many other founders, right? You really are starting from scratch, building a business. And so you learn a lot about how to run a business in that process, right? About all the other factors that go in. And that's why I think that going through that has really allowed to understand my clients in that additional level, because I know what it's like to run a business and start a business from ground up, all the different things you have to consider. And one of the things I'm able to give my clients, not only from having gone through that experience myself, but from the fact that I've negotiated thousands of agreements for clients, at this point, I'm able to give them some business kind of strategy advice too, as an additional just add on, right? A lot of startups or startup founders maybe haven't really gone through this process before, right? A lot of first time founders, or even if they have been in a company as a VP or kind of executive or something, they haven't seen as many contracts. So they may not have understanding of what's a better way to structure even the pricing, for example. So I'm able to give them some counsel about, hey, this is more standard. Maybe you should consider this.
Yeah, exactly. And you talk about first-time founders, or even founders who might not even have, other founders themselves working, together. And you mentioned something really interesting. The fact that they haven't seen a lot of contracts, right? And I have seen a lot of people cry over the founder's equity deal because it was negotiated on what can be considered to be, almost like a handshake agreement, or there was something like, oh, don't worry, you have this, and then you believe in, sort of what they were doing, and you believe that person's word, and then things happen and they're like, well, you never signed anything, so we're just going to kick you out. So I guess for folks who maybe obviously are contract deficient, what are some of your recommendations, someone getting started, or even somebody who might be already cultivating ideas with other folks? What are some of the ways that these people can kind of understand contracts, stay best protected, and most importantly, do so in a way that's not as forceful as we need to all sign this now, but maybe some elegance towards even bringing up the subject of written contracts?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very important for people to realize, and a lot of times it does take that learning process of messing it up the first time, right? But you realize that it's very important to get legal involved early, because you never know if you're going to be on the same page 6 months, a year, 5 years down the road. So getting those agreements in place day one is very important, between founders, between consultants you're working on. I always tell clients, if you don't want to, if you feel like it's going to be too aggressive for you to even say, like, let's get the agreement in place, that's fine. Just blame me. I'll take the blame. Be like my lawyer's insisting, right? Just do whatever it needs to take to get those agreements on paper, because that's when it becomes a situation that's more costly and stressful for you to address as you uh, get further along. And it actually leads to situations where a lot of businesses fail. Most startups that I've seen fail, it hasn't been because they didn't have a good idea. It was because they didn't pay attention to legal and tax issues at the beginning. So it just became a liability where no one wanted to invest in them. No one wanted to acquire them. And so they had nowhere to scale and grow. I mean, even in I've seen many of these situations come up. I'll use a recent example. Working with a company who basically had built out some, like a SaaS kind of offering, right? And they had hired some third-party developers, one-page contract. One-page contract is never sufficient. Worked with each other for about a year and a half, wanted to build out some more features. Became apparent the developers were not able to build out the features. Guess what? When they decided to get other people involved, the developer said, "Oh, you don't own this. It's ours. We were just letting you use it." And dispute, trying to resolve that. Business for now decided we're just gonna let them go for now. We'll figure out what we're gonna do with them, but we're gonna bring on a new developer. So thankfully they engaged me at that point. We got in a good place with the new developers. They actually own the code now. Now they can actually get investment, right? Now they can go to investors and say, come invest in us.
That's a straight yikes. Yeah, oh yikes. And especially with freelancers too. And even just to not disparage freelancers, I do think that that's pretty bad practice on that, development studio as well. I mean, unless there was obviously an agreement in place that kept that from happening. And it's funny, one of our team members has been in the industry for so long, and when I was first getting started, thankfully, she's seen so many contracts herself that I didn't even know what half the terms were on there at the time, and so she introduced like, "Hey, you need to include all of these provisions." And then, of course, I had obviously other legal folks look at it, but it was important to get that started just to make sure that I wasn't doing anything silly. But that's as horror story as it comes, right? And I know that especially with tech, it's so easy to not consider some of the ramifications of not just working with folks, but also licensing your technology to other people. So I'm sure you've seen some really wild stories in terms of that. So I'm just curious, for, let's just say, for folks who are in like the B2B space, or maybe like the SaaS space as well. What are some of the pitfalls of actually creating like service level agreements and things like that they might not even be aware of, because they're just starting to gain traction and now seeing the fruits of their labor, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it's, there's lots of really key issues that need to be addressed in all these transactions, particularly around intellectual property, right? Data rights and data privacy and cybersecurity. Uh, I think businesses themselves don't really necessarily understand, or their salespeople don't understand, their engineers don't understand. So it takes a while. One of the things I like to do with my clients as they particularly scale or grow is create playbooks for them so they can kind of know how to approach deals, right? So as their salespeople go out there, they kind of learn more about, okay, these are the things I need to be looking for as I'm negotiating this deal. This is when I need to escalate to legal. This is who gets to make the decision in the company. And that really helps cut down on bad deals, so that when you do get investment or acquisition, you're not going to be surprised there's some bad deals no one's ever seen, right? And so one of the stories I love is where one client initially, when I was working with them, their sales team was a mess, right? They were just like, let's close the deal. We want our commission. Like, let's just close it, right? But working with them over a period of time, they started realizing, oh, these are things we need to look out for, or these data rights are important. So they would, just when they would reach out to me, like, oh, we already know we have to negotiate that point. Yeah, we know that's a good point. And I was so proud of them, right? when you see that they're learning. So I always love when they start to get an understanding of what they need to be looking out for. I will say that one common area that a lot of businesses, no matter like how educated they do become with those playbooks and stuff in general and closing their deals, there's always situations where they're more complex deals, right? So even with this particular client, like a couple of times, they're looking at doing partnerships or collaborations or alliances. So they're doing deals in a different way than they did before, or they're doing a deal with a bigger company. In this particular situation, they were doing the deal with kind of with multiple different other startups and venture-backed companies, and they were doing it as part of a offering with a big four for the government. So it was very complicated. There was, 5 or 6 agreements in issue, different tiers and all of that. And one of the most interesting things was that obviously IP rights are very important in all of those transactions, both between all these different companies that are collaborating and also when the government's involved. And they almost unintentionally open source their software, right? So it was so important because how you structure it can have implications, right? And a lot of SaaS has open source somewhere in there, right? So I saved them from that. They were valued at 65 million at that, at that time. Now they're more. But can you imagine if they had open sourced it overnight, they would have lost all that value. So they were so thankful, but it's something they would have never even seen, right? The executives just can't see that because they're not the legal. They don't understand the implications of different structures. So that's why it's particularly important when you're deciding to do something in a new way or trying to get creative, close the deal, to make sure your legal is involved so you can talk to them and address the issues. Like one of the things I like to ask a lot of my clients when they're doing a deal that's in some way different, I get on the phone. What is it you're trying to do? I ask the hard question. And I would say about at least half the time, what they think they're going to do is not actually what they want. Like what they want to do is not what they're calling it. So like recently I had another client reach out saying that they wanted to do a joint venture. Once I got on the call and asked them the questions and got down into the level of detail, wasn't a joint venture, it was a beta test. That was it.
Oh, land. I'm sure that there's some kind of like Reddit or some kind of like place somewhere that has legal horror stories. I'm sure that exists somewhere, legal tech horror stories. But I wanted to kind of like go back to that point you were talking about with like these almost like distribution partnerships, right? And I think it's a very valid way to grow. I mean, it's something that we've done with referral partnerships, and we, do a lot of those even with our own customer base, which is great. I mean, I always like to call it the spreading the joy, right?
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of what happens though is some people don't actually look in great detail what they're promising in those referral agreements, right? And what I noticed was there was somebody who like they put together a referral agreement where it was like, hey, this person you're going to pay this person X amount, like the first full month's payment, right? Like whatever, you get their first full month of them signing up, and then we'll take it from there. And I was like, you do realize that you've like basically incentivize them to grab people to come on and they can just churn out like literally the next month, right? So I always just thought that was just like like I always see really weird stuff on referral agreements and partnerships because people don't really take that into account, like all of the weird stuff that happens. So I guess like for a company that's looking to grow through that avenue, right, what are some of the things that you've seen that people have done mistake wise, or what are maybe some of the things that people should avoid when you're trying to work with like referral partnerships or partnerships that are like channel partners and things like that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of different opportunities to really grow your business through collaborations and partnerships. And it's definitely different opportunities that clients of mine have taken to grow, right? Whether it's through reseller, referral, through, strategic alliances or white labeling, what OEMs, whatever it may be. There are different ways you can structure all of this. In particular, in terms of like referral and like reseller, there is complexities between those situations. So I think it's businesses sometimes think it's like a cut and paste. They're like, well, here's the agreement, we're just going to sign it, right? But there are issues in there around IP, data, security, like what's being shared, right? Is it really a reseller? Is it really a referral situation? Like which one of those really is it? Is it mutual? Is it one way? How are payments structured? How, what kind of, the payment structure can be really complicated about like when payments are due, like how you will get to check how much is being earned, what's deducted, all of that. So that can be like a highly negotiated point. And I think a lot of times what I've seen with a lot of these deals, there isn't enough level of detail. That's like very common. Just the deal doesn't have enough level of detail so that if a dispute arises, you guys are in a dispute, which is why it's important to, again, negotiate and get the legal involved so you can get in the level of detail. So the dispute is less likely to arise. Or if it does arise, you have a situation where you're like, well, the contract already covers that, right? It's clear terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of my favorite stories, not to name names, but one of my favorite stories is someone I know. He always likes to use those online template sites, right? And so they're like, "Oh, I can just pay X amount, go through this, and I can just send it out to people." And sure, I mean, like literally, you can. Should you do it? Maybe you should go have someone look at it. Definitely should have someone go look at it, right? And I think that there's unfortunately, with the limited resources a lot of startups have, and really, unless you're venture funded, and even that, and even in that case, you're still not feeling good about some of those things sometimes. With the limited resources some of these earlier stage companies have, they try to like sort of cut the corners of, hey, I don't really want to get legal counsel. I'm just going to use a template that's been approved by lawyers online or something like that. So, is there actually a benefit to actually utilizing those services, or is it that you should maybe use those services and at the very least check with legal counsel before you send this over to anybody in a professional setting?
Yeah, so those services, from my experience, are literally a mess. Like they have resulted in situations where clients have like had disputes, have not had rights, things like that. I think that one thing to remember is those those so-called like templates are not really, they're not drafted by attorneys who really understand, one, the space in general, and two, they're not specific to your business. So they're not going to fit. And so it's never a good fit. And one of the things I always tell clients when they may have some template, they come to me like, this is what we've been using. I'm like, do you want me to try to save this, or do you want me to just do your own thing? Because trying to save that is going to cost more and take more time than just starting from scratch. Or we can make sure you have a good agreement in place. And clients get that. Like I've never had someone be like, oh yeah, let's try to save the mess, right? So it's, those agreements don't really serve you. I think one thing I do for clients is we create templates that are specific for the client's business. So that is something I think a business should be prepared to invest in. If you're seeing that there's a certain type of agreement that you are using over and over, invest in getting a good template in place, but with your attorney, right? So the attorney will help you. Like I help my clients create the template. I also create I put instructions and guidelines in there for them so that when they go negotiate every single deal, they have some guidance. And so they only have to reach out to me if it, like maybe the customer's negotiating more than they usually do on this deal. So they have a question, right? So that way it makes it easy for them to use over and over with their deals. And I think there are particular agreements that a company needs to prioritize investing in. One is the customer agreement that they have. So that depends on what kind of business you are. So if you're a SaaS agreement, that'll be your SaaS agreement, your subscription agreement, however you structure that. You're using that to generate revenue. That's what all your investors are going to look at. Your acquirer is going to look at. That determines who owns IP. That includes your liabilities. That should be a good good form. Like you should invest in getting a good SaaS agreement if you're a SaaS business, right? If there's other situations that you are seeing come up a lot, then you should invest in those too. So if you know you're creating like a formal, say you're creating a formal reseller situation where you're like, you know what, we have consistent revenue we're bringing into through resellers, well, then you should probably work with your attorney to get a reseller agreement in place. And same thing, create a template you offer, and then you only have to negotiate if, one potential reseller is maybe a larger company and is trying to negotiate with you.
Yeah, and it's funny too because it's like this is actually something that's revenue generating, and yet you want to cut corners on the one thing that's actually going to bring you like lifeblood to the organization. It's just like it's baffling, right? Like I see some wild stuff sometimes, and I'm sure obviously you've seen more than I have, but I think that what I think is really interesting is a lot of folks who haven't dealt with legal, other than beyond maybe let's say they might have done legal for like, maybe, small claims court or things like that. They're not familiar with like real legal stuff. So they're really unfamiliar sometimes with the entire process of, working with a lawyer, working with a law office, and then, they come to what is actually, working with these people, and they're unsure why they have like sort of all of these little, sort of nuances of the process, and they just generally gain this distrust of working with that person. And I think that's kind of unfair because it's just sort of them not really being educated about what happens and what the process is. So I guess for folks who are working with, even for someone who's working with you for the first time, right? What are some of the things that somebody, could do to prepare themselves to help them understand, like, hey, this is the process of working with a lawyer, and you have to understand that these are the associated costs, the associated timeline to getting something complete. How could they prepare themselves before they go ahead and obviously, hire legal counsel?
Yeah, I think one thing to kind of understand, like, it kind of goes back to like the point we were talking about before. I think a lot of times, these founders are looking for investors and things like that, right? But a lot of times they're unwilling to invest in the business themselves. And it's kind of, you can't ask others to be willing to invest in you when you're not prepared to invest in the business yourself. Like, investors are looking for you to have skin in the game, right? So you need to start putting budgets towards all of this. And a lot of people, you will ask them like, hey, have you budgeted towards them? They're like, no, not budget. And so that's one of the issues. Like, you should create a budget. Like, and one thing I tell, like, early stage companies I work with is, we don't have to do it all like day one, right? If you have a limited budget, we can spread it out. Like, let's do the most important thing. Like, again, for a lot of SaaS companies, SaaS agreement is important. Let's do the SaaS agreement now. And then, you have a reseller program going, great. Don't have the budget for it now? Great. We'll come back in 4, 5, 6 months when you have a budget again. We'll do that next. Let's just have a strategy where we go forward to make sure you're getting the legal addressed in your business as well. So that's what I think is important for businesses. I will tell you, I've had multiple people in the past year reach out to me and then tell me they're looking for investment and they want to work on their business. And I ask them what's their entity, where's the business, etc. Oh, no, we don't want to spend money yet. So we haven't created it. All the investors will give us money to create it. No investor is going to give you money to create an entity. You just have an idea. That's not how it works. So they expect people to give them money, not even for equity, right?
That's so funny. And like, first of all, if you're not even willing to go and get like whatever you want to do, obviously most people do the Delaware C Corp. I don't think most people probably invest in that because of the whole like NVCA thing, right? Which, by the way, if we want to talk about an unfortunate story, talked with a friend of mine who was like, wait, I incorporated in California. Like, what do can I go and like incorporate in Delaware? And I'm like, well, I mean, I didn't really know the answer to this. You can probably know better than me, but I kind of was like, kind of not really, right? Like, And so I just thought that was funny because he was like, he was sort of thinking like, why is it that my business is unappealing? So he at least like took the step to do it, but he didn't consult people about it and therefore made the wrong decision, which is unfortunate. Then there's all my favorite question actually that has come up, maybe not recently, but throughout the scope of my time in early stage companies. Can I turn my LLC into a C corp? Because like a lot of people don't know the pitfalls of doing that, because there's a lot of interesting information around the internet saying, well, why don't you just start out as an LLC and become a C corp, right? So I guess like obviously hearing it from you, you are the master and the expert here. What is there a benefit to going from an LLC to a C corp? And if so, is there a time like that someone should be like, okay, I'm ready to convert? And what are really the not even monetary costs, but even the effort costs associated with doing so?
Yeah, I think that really the question should be when you're at an initial stage of the business, like for clients that come to me like really, really early stage, right, where they haven't even like set up their businesses yet. I like to have the conversation with them of what are your goals for the business, right? Like, what is it you're trying to do in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And that'll kind of inform our strategy around how to structure the business, at least from the legal side. And then I always tell them, you need to have a discussion with your tax advisor as well, because there's tax considerations that go into that structure question as well. So I think businesses often, I think they just hear keywords. Another keyword I've heard from a lot of people is when they reach out, they're like, I want to be an S corp. I'm like, okay, but that's not a legal thing. Like, that's not a legal thing. A LC or a corporation can be an S corp. Like, we can talk about the legal thing, and then you can need to talk to accountant about, is S corp make sense what I'm trying to do, right? So I think it's so much that people don't even realize their options, and that's what I think it's very important to have that discussion about business structure with your attorney and also your tax advisor, because then you can make an informed choice, right? If you're going to do a startup and you're looking for venture capital, you're going to go for corporation in Delaware, right? That's just what BC people want to see. Having to do a conversion, yes, you can do that, but it's just adding complexity and additional costs to your business. So it's like, okay, I'm like, an LC is a little bit cheaper to like set up at the beginning, but like now I have to deal with all this complexity down the road. Do I really want to do that? Right. So, you can discuss it. And usually I would I think, go ahead and just do it the right way at the beginning, so you don't have to worry about stress down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I feel like that's sometimes when I talk to folks, they have this question about like sort of all of that. Cause I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, cause I never did this. So I don't want to be talking out of, thin air. But, I remember when my friend, he did an LLC and then decided to, build change it to a C corp so he could get investment, right? Because they weren't going to invest in like an LLC and stuff. And he was talking about all of like the stuff like changing, doing all the paperwork to change over from the LLC to the C corp that, really kind of like honestly was super distracting because there was only 3 people at the company. So him taking out from doing that basically kind of tanked the company in a way, right? And even, I always call these little, sort of these little places where if something, they're the little points of balance, I like to say, where if you even like tip it in one way, your house of cards like, falls flat because it's so fragile sometimes at early stage, right? Anything from like the founder or CEO getting sick and, God forbid, dying could tank the company or like, things like that. So to me, like that transition from like LLC where they were doing fine, moving along, building things all the way up to C Corp, or moving it over to C Corp really was negatively affecting it. And that story always sticks to me. And so that's why I'm always, kind of curious, like, what was even kind of like, I guess, the benefit of even doing that. So it's always just been something that is in the back of my mind,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why it's important to have these conversations early, right? And that's why I always say, again, important to get legal involved early. And I'll like use another example. There was a company I talked to a couple years ago, and they reached out, and we were kind of like looking at their business model, analyzing that. And they've been operating for about 1.5 years, spent a lot of time and money with consultants, building out a prototype. Well, once I did all the kind of looked at their business model, did the analysis, well, their business model was illegal. So they now had to basically decide to redo the whole structure. And of course, there's some liability for what's happened already, right? They decided that they were just going to shut down the business because it was just too much to look to do. And again, not a bad idea, but because they didn't get, even if they brought me in on day one, right, and said, hey, this is what we're trying to do. What do you think? Do you see problems? They could have adjusted it before they invested the time and money to build out this business instead of building out a business that had nowhere to grow. You can't scale a business that's just liability, right? No investor is going to invest in a business that's operating under, fraud and other illegal models.
Wow. Operating on that must be a fun conversation. Somebody comes into your office and is like, hey, I have a business that is based around fraud.
But that's the thing, right? Like, it's not like obvious, right?
Yeah.
And that's where they don't know. It's like when you're not a lawyer, you don't realize, you think you're being creative, and it's like, no, that's like actually falls into fraud.
That's so funny too. And it's going into like, so of course you mentioning being a futurist, and we're talking about, some really, interesting things here. I've always found the fascinating concept of like the digital, obviously the boom in digital art we saw like for a couple years there, and the giant like kind of shitstorm that comes with a bunch of people like, oh well, if I take a picture of this image, like I'm basically like stealing from this person. But it's like most of the time there was nothing these people could do, right? And now you have it circulating, and the value of it basically tanked. Like there's not really an original source, but everything was kind of like stuck in the blockchain. If you're talking about NFTs, or maybe you have some kind of other like sort of DAO that has a system of who owned it and who didn't. But there was too many stories, I felt like, of people who had, oh, it was $1 million, and then now it's like $5,000. So you bought something and then it's cratered pretty much like 99.995% of value. So when did you ever work with like some of the aspects of those kind of companies, like companies that were putting out like NFTs, blockchain, like either as companies or, part of their company strategy? And how like challenging was that to kind of like navigate during those times?
Yeah, I have been involved in the kind of blockchain crypto space as part of my practice, and I've seen it go through multiple ups and downs now, right? So I find that it's still about, I would say, it's like the 90s of the blockchain. It's still very, very early days. I will say a lot of the companies I knew in the last go around back in like 2017, 2018, I would say about 90 something percent of them were not trying to build legitimate businesses. And I think that was true of all the people I spoke to in this latest go around from last year. They reach out, they want to raise a lot of funds, they don't want to comply with securities laws. And when you tell them like, hey, this is the way to do it the right way, they're kind of like, oh, well, I didn't realize that. Like, I don't want to do that. Right. And so those businesses fail. Like the businesses from last go around, they've either shut down and disappeared, and the people have moved on to totally different industries. Like they're out of blockchain, or they've settled with the SEC for criminal violations, right? So there's some legitimate businesses that are in the space, but I would say the majority is people who quite don't understand the space and are trying to like just get part of the hype to get funds, right? So that's kind of been my experience with a lot of the actual people who are working in the space. I do think it definitely has a lot of potential. There's a lot of use cases for the technology, and there's a lot of interesting problems like with the NFTs, right? I think people were very excited. It totally makes sense. The initial NFTs actually were around last go around, right? There was crypto kitties. So these things have been around for a while. But with the newest go around, it was really interesting because a lot of the NFTs that were being sold, they were not actually something unique, right? Like it was like an autographed copy, like the Twitter from Jack Dorsey, the tweet, right? It was just basically an autographed copy, right? The tweet was still on Twitter. Like it's not like they owned the IP, but for some reason people were very confused and thought they would own IP to these things. And it's like, well, the IP is not being transferred to you. You're just having a copy of it. And a lot of times the NFT wasn't even on the blockchain. It was just a link on the blockchain that went to some third-party site. So that third-party site could go down at any time, and then you just have a dead link. So you've paid a lot for a dead link.
Yikes. And what's funny is, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think that there's a fantastic application for some of the technologies that I've read about, and I have begun to understand it, just obviously to just wrap my hand around it. And the joke I've seen in the tech industry is, oh, you guys were in blockchain, oh, now you're in AI. Like, and so now there's like obviously a lot of people trying to raise off of hype there, and people building things all over the place. And now you're seeing something different in legal. Right, you're seeing something now where people, for example, the UMG stuff, right? Someone made like the Drake song and like, kind of ghost produced this, and then all like these other platforms, like, I think it was like Tidal and Deezer and like a few other places, and UMG responded, and they're like, well, who's how can you like go and utilize the name and the likeness of somebody and utilize their voice, and then it's like, who are they? So I feel like AI now brings a unique other challenge, because now there's things like deep fakes, now there's things like using your voice, and people are using it for more comedic and benign purposes in places. But what about like, oh, you use the voice, you use your voice to activate really important things in your house, or things online, and now it's basically a digital signature of yourself. So now that we've kind of seen this explosion of that type of technology, where do you see some of the challenges, especially moving forward?
Yeah, well, I think, a couple things. We've seen AI, I think, has been mass adopted at the enterprise level for years, right? Like a lot of my SaaS clients have AI, then they have clients that are, in the Fortune 100 and all of that. I think consumers haven't seen it. So this is the first time we're seeing it kind of more massively available at the consumer level. And I think it's going to be very interesting because you're already starting to see a lot of talk as well as lawsuits around IP rights, right? Because a lot of these AI, well, all of them really have been trained from scraping data on the internet. So on other people's intellectual property, and intellectual property owners are usually the only ones who can create derivative works. So now we have this whole situation where, like arguably derivative works are being created as output. Who owns that? And, we have cases against Getty, or Getty has sued Stability AI because of the scraping of their information. There's some suits against OpenAI, the UMG, there was a cease and desist letter, right? So we're starting to see assertion of rights because this is where value lies. And we are going to have to wait to see what the courts say in terms of whether this is infringement or it's allowed to move forward. And I think once we see that, we'll differentiate where people create their IP. So I think if we are seeing that IP is being scrapped and there is no infringement or monetization due to you from your data being taken, we're probably going to have private communities where people will, like artists, will release the information instead of openly on the internet, right? Because AI is going to be scraping all of that. So that's going to be very kind of interesting to see. I do think there's going to be privacy and data, like data privacy and cybersecurity issues. People have already put private information into, people don't understand how these AIs even work, right? So people put private data onto like ChatGPT. So Samsung had a couple data leaks because of that, because their employees went in there and put in source code and other things where they own right now. Now OpenAI has that, right? It's part of their training data. It can show up in output. So I think businesses have to be more, put a little bit forethought in training their employees about what these tools can be used for, or how they can be used, what can be submitted to them, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we've run out of time here. I want to say how much I really appreciate you giving us an in-depth legal discussion. And of course, I wanted to give you the opportunity, if you wanted to mention anything before we sign off here, anything you'd like to promote, feel free to go ahead. But if not, I can go ahead and wrap up the show.
Yeah, well, I was happy to join you all today. As a reminder, nothing we talked about is legal advice. It's all purely educational. If anyone does need help, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you could email me. My email's, my first initial last name at mylastnamelaw.com. Happy to help work with anyone who is in the tech or SaaS space.
Awesome. And well, thank you so much once again for joining us. This was so educational and insightful. And for those of you who do want to link, I'll be providing her profile on the post as well. And so you can find it there. But for all of you listening at home, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Have a great rest of your week.